Harrington family crest, an emblem of legacy and immense wealth, was etched into everything from the dinner plates to the towering iron gates. It symbolized a dynasty built by one man's ruthless ambition, Arthur Harrington. He was a king in his castle, and tonight he was entertaining titans of industry. But among the crystal and champagne, a silent observer moved through the halls, a maid known only as Joanna. When a single drop of red wine threatened to derail a billion-dollar deal, Arthur's fury erupted. He ordered the young black woman out of his home, a public and brutal dismissal, but he never imagined that her response, a single quiet sentence, would not just silence the room, but detonate the very foundation of his empire and expose a secret that had been buried for decades. What did she say? The answer will change everything you think you know about power, Justice, and the secrets hidden in plain sight. The air in the Harrington Grand Ballroom was thick with the scent of money. It was a complex perfume, a blend of vintage Dom Perignon, the delicate aroma of pan-seared scallops with truffle foam, and the subtle expensive fragrances worn by the guests themselves. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto the scene below, making diamonds glitter on wrinkled necks and Rolexes gleam on suntanned wrists. This was the kingdom of Arthur Harrington, and tonight he was holding court. At the head of the impossibly long mahogany table sat Arthur himself. At 65, he was a monument to brutal success. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His jaw was set with the permanent aggression of a man who had never taken no for an answer, and his eyes, a piercing cold blue, missed nothing. They scanned the room, assessing, judging, calculating. To his right sat his wife, Beatrice. Decades his junior, she was as much a part of the decor as the Renaissance paintings on the wall, beautiful, expensive, and largely silent. Her smiles were practiced, her posture perfect. She was the envy of many, but those closer to the family knew she was a bird in a gilded cage, her wings clipped by the weight of the Harrington name. Across from her slumped their son, Ethan, 22, and already showing the telltale signs of inherited wealth and zero responsibility. He toyed with his phone beneath the tablecloth, his expression a mask of bored indifference. He was a disappointment to Arthur, a problem to be managed, rather than a legacy to be nurtured. The guest of honor was Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a technology magnate from Tokyo, whose handshake could redirect the flow of global commerce. The evening was a meticulously orchestrated performance designed to culminate in the signing of a multi-billion-dollar merger that would cement the Harrington legacy for another generation. Every detail was perfect, from the temperature of the wine to the thread count of the linen napkins. Moving silently along the periphery of this grand theatre was Joanna Williams. To the glittering assembly, she was invisible, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. She was 28, though the quiet gravity in her eyes made her seem older. Her movements were fluid and economical, a study in practiced efficiency. She refilled water glasses without a sound, cleared plates without disturbing conversations, and anticipated needs before they were voiced. For 6 months, she had served in this house, observing its rhythms, its secrets, and the chilling temperament of its master. She had taken the job for one reason, a purpose that burned like a cold, steady flame within her. It had nothing to do with the generous salary or the prestigious address. It had everything to do with the name once carved into the stone mantelpiece of the very fireplace that now warmed Arthur Harrington's guests' Davenport. Her grandmother used to tell her stories of this house not as a mansion, but as a home. She spoke of grand oak trees in the yard where her father, William Davenport, had hung a tire swing. She described the secret reading nook behind a bookshelf in the library. To her, it was a lost paradise, a history stolen and rewritten by the man who now sat at the head of the table. Joanna's presence here was the final act of a long, painful investigation. Her mother had spent years gathering whispers and rumors, but it was Joanna with her sharp mind and unwavering resolve who had decided to get inside to find the proof that had eluded them for so long. She wasn't just a maid, she was a hunter, and she was closing in on her prey. More wine. "Mr. Harrington," she asked, her voice a low, respectful murmur. Arthur didn't even look at her. He waved a dismissive hand, deep in conversation with Mr. Tanaka about market projections. "Of course. Don't let the glasses get empty. That's your only job." The casual cruelty of his words was nothing new. She had seen him berate the groundskeeper for a single stray leaf on the lawn, heard him ridicule Beatrice for choosing the wrong flower arrangement, and witnessed him verbally disembowel a junior executive over a minor typo in a report. His power was not just in his wealth, but in his ability to diminish everyone around him. Joanna moved to his side, the heavy bottle of Chateau Margaux in her hand. Her focus was absolute as she tilted the bottle, the dark red liquid flowing in a silent, steady stream into his glass. Mr. Tanaka was laughing at a joke Arthur had just made, his head tilted back. At that precise moment, Ethan, bored with his phone, stretched his legs out abruptly under the table. His foot knocked the leg of Joanna's serving trolley. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible jolt, but it was enough. Her hand, so steady for months, faltered for a fraction of a second. A single dark red drop escaped the stream. It arced through the air in a perfect, horrifying parabola, landing directly on the crisp white cuff of Mr. Tanaka's custom-tailored shirt. The drop blossomed into a crimson stain, a glaring imperfection in a world of curated perfection. Laughter died in Mr. Tanaka's throat. His eyes widened as he looked down at his sleeve. The entire table fell silent. The clinking of cutlery ceased. The low hum of conversation vanished. In the cavernous room, the sudden quiet was as loud as a gunshot. Joanna froze, the bottle still in her hand. She could feel every eye in the room on her. But most of all, she could feel the arctic chill of Arthur Harrington's gaze. He turned his head slowly, his blue eyes locking onto her. There was no anger in them yet, just a terrifying, predatory stillness. The performance was over. The real Arthur Harrington was about to take the stage. The silence in the ballroom stretched for an eternity. The crimson stain on Mr. Tanaka's cuff seemed to pulse under the chandelier light, a beacon of Joanna's catastrophic error. Mr. Tanaka, a man of impeccable manners, attempted to salvage the moment. "Ah, no matter," he said with a tight, forced smile, dabbing at the spot with his napkin. "A casualty of a fine evening. Please don't worry." But his words were lost in the suffocating atmosphere created by his host. Arthur Harrington's face had transformed. The charming, powerful businessman was gone, replaced by a visage of pure, unadulterated fury. His lips thinned into a white line, and a vein throbbed at his temple. He didn't speak to Mr. Tanaka. His entire being was focused on Joanna. He began, his voice deceptively low and menacing. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Joanna stood motionless, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just over his shoulder, a technique she'd mastered to endure his tirades. "I am so sorry, Mr. Harrington. It was an accident. My deepest apologies, Mr. Tanaka." "An accident?" Arthur's voice rose, cracking like a whip through the silent room. "Incompetence is not an accident. It is a character flaw. This shirt," he gestured wildly at Mr. Tanaka's sleeve, "costs more than you make in a month. This wine," he pointed at the bottle still clutched in her hand, "is worth more than your entire pathetic existence." Beatrice paled, placing a trembling hand on her husband's arm. "Arthur, please. It's nothing. Mr. Tanaka understands." He shook her off without a glance. "Stay out of this, Beatrice." He rose slowly from his chair, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Joanna. He was a predator, savoring the kill. The other guests stared at their plates, their food anywhere but at the brutal spectacle unfolding before them. They were complicit in their silence, unwilling to risk the king's wrath. 6 months you have been in this house," Arthur snarled, stepping closer. Joanna could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "And in all that time have you learned nothing? You are here to be invisible. You are here to serve. You are not to make mistakes. You are not to be a clumsy, useless distraction." Ethan, for the first time, looked up from his phone, a flicker of something, shame perhaps, or discomfort in his eyes. He knew his foot had caused the jolt, but he remained silent, cowed by his father's volcanic temper. "I asked for the best staff?" Arthur continued, his voice now a booming roar that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "The agency sent me you. They assured me you were discreet professional. Instead, I get this embarrassment." He spat the word out like poison. He turned to the rest of the table, his arms spread wide, as if presenting a piece of evidence. This is what happens when standards slip. You allow one small crack, and the whole foundation begins to crumble. This merger with Tanaka-san's company is about precision, about perfection. And I will not have it jeopardized by the bumbling of a worthless maid. The word hung in the air, weighted with all the contempt he could muster. He was making an example of her, using her humiliation as a grotesque display of his own power and his commitment to flawlessness. Joanna's mind raced. This was not part of the plan. Her plan was to remain invisible, to find the last piece of evidence she needed, the original, unaltered deed to the property, which her research suggested was hidden somewhere in Arthur's private study, and then hand everything over to her lawyer. A public confrontation was a disastrous complication. "Sir, if you would just allow me to fetch a stain remover," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Fetch?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You will fetch nothing. You are finished here. Your employment is terminated. I want you out of my sight. I want you out of my house. Now." He pointed a finger toward the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom. It was a gesture of absolute banishment. The room held its breath. The staff peeking from the service corridors froze in fear. Beatrice closed her eyes, her knuckles white where she gripped the tablecloth. Mr. Tanaka looked profoundly uncomfortable, the source of the incident now a minor detail in a much larger display of cruelty. Joanna didn't move. Her training, her instincts, her carefully laid plans all screamed at her to retreat, to apologize again, and to disappear as instructed. But something else, something deeper and far older, held her rooted to the spot. It was the memory of her grandmother's stories, the righteous anger of her mother, the weight of a stolen legacy. She had come here for justice, not to be chased away like a stray dog. "Did you hear me?" Arthur bellowed, his face now inches from hers. "I said get out!" He was practically vibrating with rage. He expected her to flinch, to scurry away in tears. He expected fear and submission. Instead, Joanna finally lifted her gaze from the spot on the wall and met his eyes directly. For the first time, he was not looking at a servant. He was looking into the cool, unflinching eyes of a woman who was not afraid of him. Her chin lifted slightly. The fear that had been hammering at her chest subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The moment had come. Not the one she had planned, but the one that had been chosen for her. All her careful preparations, All the quiet months of searching had led to this public crucible. "Your house," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an astonishing weight that cut through the tension. It was not a question. It was a correction. Arthur blinked, thrown off by her sudden defiance. "What did you just say to me?" Joanna took a slow, deliberate breath. The room, the guests, the half-eaten scallops, it all faded away. There was only this man, this thief, standing on stolen ground. She held his gaze and delivered the sentence she had rehearsed in her mind, 1,000 times the sentence that would bring his gilded world crashing down around him. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Joanna and Arthur Harrington. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Every person at the table, every servant in the wings was a statue in a tableau of suspense. Arthur's face was a mask of disbelief, his rage momentarily eclipsed by sheer astonishment at her audacity. "I asked you a question," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "What did you say?" Joanna's voice, when she spoke again, was as clear and sharp as splintered glass. It held no trace of the subservient maid he had just tried to discard. It was the voice of a woman coming into her own power. "I said this isn't your house to order me out of Mr. Harrington." A collective gasp, sharp and audible, rippled around the table. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan's jaw dropped. Mr. Tanaka's eyebrows shot up into his hairline. This was no longer a simple firing. It was an act of open rebellion. Arthur stared at her, his mind struggling to process the defiance. He saw the maid's uniform, but he heard the tone of an equal. A small, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "I am losing my mind. The help has gone insane." "Are you drunk?" he sneered. "What gives you the right to say something so utterly stupid?" Joanna's expression remained unchanged. Her calm in the face of his fury was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. "The truth gives me the right," she said, "and the truth is, this house has never truly been yours. It was stolen." The word "stolen" hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was an accusation of such magnitude, made in such a public forum, that it seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. Arthur's face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson. "That's it," he seethed, turning to the 2 burly security guards who stood discreetly near the entrance. "Paul Robert, escort this woman off my property. Now. If she resists, have her arrested for trespassing." The 2 guards, large men in tailored suits, began to move forward. But they hesitated as Joanna spoke, again, her voice ringing with an authority that stopped them in their tracks. "My name is not Joanna Williams," she announced, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces at the table before landing back on Arthur. "That is the name I used to get through your door. My name is Joanna Davenport." The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Davenport, a name that hadn't been uttered with any significance in this house for over 30 years. To the younger guests, it meant nothing, but Beatrice's eyes widened in recognition. And Albert, the elderly butler who had served the Harringtons for decades, and the Davenports before them, froze in the service corridor, a silver tray slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. Arthur's sneer faltered. For the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty, of primal fear, entered his cold blue eyes. He knew that name. He knew it intimately. It was the name of the man who had been his mentor, his benefactor, the man whose trust he had so completely betrayed. Davenport. He scoffed, recovering quickly, but the bravado rang hollow. William Davenport had 1 child, a daughter who died years ago. She had no children. You're a liar. A pathetic, delusional little girl trying to extort money. My mother, Jessica Davenport, did not die when you said she did. Joanna countered her voice, gaining strength with every word. She fled after you ruined her father and stole his legacy. She lived in fear of you for the rest of her life. And yes, she had a child. She had me. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The power dynamic in the room had inverted completely. She was no longer the accused. She was the accuser. He was no longer the king on his throne. He was a man on a witness stand. I have spent the last 6 months in this house, she continued, her voice resonating with the weight of generations of injustice. I have served you your meals. I have cleaned your floors. I have dusted the portraits of a family that has no right to be on these walls. And I have been searching. I have been looking for the proof of what you did to my grandfather, William Davenport. Arthur's face was now ashen. The blood had drained from it, leaving behind a waxy pale sheen. This is preposterous. It's slander. I bought this house legally. You call it a legal purchase? Joanna cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. My grandfather called it the ultimate betrayal. You forced him to sign over his assets, his company, and this very house, while he was on his deathbed, riddled with morphine and barely coherent. You told him it was a temporary measure to protect the estate from creditors. You were his protégé, the son he never had. He trusted you. Each word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the facade Arthur Harrington had spent a lifetime constructing. The guests were no longer just watching a drama. They were witnesses to the excavation of a terrible crime. And this house, Joanna said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout, was not just an asset. It was the heart of the Davenport estate, held in a trust that you, as his executor, illegally dissolved. She paused, letting the full weight of her accusation settle into the horrified silence. She looked past Arthur at the grand fireplace, at the walls that held the memories of her ancestors. Then she delivered the final devastating sentence that stunned the mansion into absolute silence. And last week, in the false bottom of my grandfather's old humidor hidden in the back of your library, I found the original trust document, the one you thought you had destroyed. The silence that followed Joanna's declaration was profound. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of the past, with the weight of a 30-year-old betrayal brought violently into the light. The clatter of the dropped silver tray from the hallway was the only sound that had dared to intrude a punctuation mark on the collapse of an empire. Arthur Harrington stood as if turned to stone, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, rage, disbelief, and underneath it all a rising tide of pure, unadulterated panic. The humidor. He remembered it. A beautiful mahogany box he'd kept for its sentimental value, a trophy from his conquest. He'd cleared it out himself, or so he thought. The idea of a false bottom, a secret he'd lived with for decades without knowing, was so inconceivable it almost made him laugh. But the look in Joanna's eyes, the unwavering, certain look of someone holding a royal flush, strangled the sound in his throat. Mr. Tanaka, a man whose entire business philosophy was built on honor and integrity, slowly placed his napkin on the table. He looked from Joanna's resolute face to Arthur's crumbling facade, and his expression hardened into one of cold disgust. The billion-dollar merger was already dead. All that remained was the funeral. It was Beatrice who finally broke the spell. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is she talking about?" Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out, a denial, a threat that could possibly work. But every path was a dead end. Joanna saw the confusion and horror on the faces of the guests, and she knew she had to fill the silence with the truth, her truth. She began to speak, not to Arthur, but to the room at large, her voice clear and measured like a historian recounting a lost chapter. "My grandfather William Davenport built his fortune from the ground up," she began. "He wasn't born into wealth like some. He created it through ingenuity and hard work. This house was his masterpiece, a symbol that anything was possible in this country. He was a good man, a trusting man." Her eyes flickered to Arthur. Perhaps too trusting. He met Arthur Harrington when Arthur was just a young man, hungry and ambitious with a sharp mind, but no connections. My grandfather saw a reflection of his younger self in him. He took him under his wing, mentored him, gave him a position in his company, and treated him like a son. She paced slowly, her simple black uniform, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. She had their undivided attention. For 15 years, Arthur was my grandfather's right hand. He was given access to everything finances, legal documents, private affairs. When my grandmother passed away, my grandfather fell into a deep depression. A year later, he was diagnosed with a cancer that moved with devastating speed. Her voice caught for a moment, the inherited pain of a generation surfacing. She took a breath and steadied herself. That was when Arthur made his move. He saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. My mother Jessica was only 19 at the time, overwhelmed with caring for her father. Arthur convinced my grandfather that the company was facing a hostile takeover and that his assets were vulnerable. He preyed on his fear and his failing health. She stopped in front of the grand fireplace, placing a hand on the cool marble of the mantelpiece. He drafted a series of documents. He told my grandfather they were temporary power of attorney papers, a way to shield the estate until he recovered. He brought them to his bedside in the final weeks when my grandfather was weak, disoriented, and being given heavy doses of morphine for the pain. My grandfather, trusting the man he considered a son, signed everything. A low murmur went through the room. This was not just a business dispute, it was a story of profound personal betrayal. "But they weren't temporary papers," Joanna continued, her voice hardening. "It was a complete transfer of assets, a sale of his company for $1, a liquidation of his stock portfolio, and a deed of sale for this house. My mother questioned it, but Arthur produced a letter, supposedly in my grandfather's hand, disowning her for her lack of faith and naming him the sole heir. The letter was a forgery, of course. My mother, a heartbroken 19-year-old girl, was then forced out of her own home by the man who used to pat her on the head and call her kiddo." She turned her gaze back to Arthur. "You didn't just take his house and his company. You took his legacy. You erased him. You took down his portraits and put up your own. You chiseled the Davenport name off the stone archway at the front gate. You told the world that William Davenport had died a broken, bankrupt man, and that you, his loyal protégé, had salvaged what you could from the wreckage. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it had been believed for 30 years. Arthur had built his entire identity on that lie. He was the brilliant businessman who had turned a failing enterprise into a global powerhouse. But Joanna was revealing the truth. He was not a builder. He was a grave robber. My mother lived the rest of her life, looking over her shoulder. Joanna's voice was now thick with emotion. You threatened her, told her if she ever spoke a word, you would ruin her, that no one would believe a hysterical girl over a respected businessman. She raised me on stories of this house, of the grandfather I never met. Before she died, she gave me everything she had, her memories, her suspicions, and a burning need for justice. That is why I came here. Not for the money, Mr. Harrington, but to take back our name, to restore the truth. Her story hung in the air, irrefutable and devastating. The legal and financial implications were staggering, but the moral indictment was even more damning. Arthur Harrington was not a self-made man. He was a fraud, and his entire life was a monument to a single monstrous lie. He finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate rasp. "Lies, all of it. You have no proof. A piece of paper you claim to have found. It's a forgery. You planted it." Joanna gave him a sad, pitying smile. Did I also plant the witness who saw you guide my grandfather's hand as he signed those papers? The nurse you paid off to administer an extra dose of morphine just before the signing. Did I plant the memories of the staff who were here then? Her eyes darted to the service corridor, where the elderly butler Albert stood pale and trembling tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He had been a young man then, working for William Davenport. He had seen it all. His silence over the years had been a prison one, from which Joanna was now freeing him. Arthur followed her gaze and saw Albert. The recognition, the shared secret of that terrible day passed between them. In that single moment, Arthur knew the game was over. And just as that realization dawned, the grand double doors of the ballroom swung open. A calm, impeccably dressed man in a sharp suit stepped inside. He had a kind but serious face and carried a leather briefcase. "It seems I've arrived at the opportune moment," the man said, his voice projecting easily across the room. Joanna's face broke into a small, relieved smile. "Mr. Harrington guests," she said calmly. "Allow me to introduce my legal counsel, Mr. David Chen." The arrival of David Chen was a masterstroke of timing, a perfectly executed checkmate in a game Arthur Harrington didn't even know he was losing. Chen was not a theatrical lawyer who postured and shouted. His power was in his stillness, in the quiet confidence that radiated from him. He walked into the room not as an intruder, but as a correcting force, an arbiter of a long overdue reckoning. He nodded politely to the stunned assembly before fixing his calm, intelligent gaze on Arthur. "Mr. Harrington, my name is David Chen. I represent the estate of the late William Davenport and its sole heir, Ms. Joanna Davenport." He set his leather briefcase on a nearby serving table and clicked the latches open with two sharp, definitive snaps. The sound echoed in the silent room like a judge's gavel. Arthur cornered and, desperate, fell back on his old tactics, bluster and intimidation. "I don't know who you are, but you and this lying girl are trespassing. I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyers. You will be sued for slander, for defamation, for every penny you don't have." Chen didn't even blink. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "You are welcome to call anyone you wish, Mr. Harrington. But before you do, you might want to look at this." He slid the top document across the polished surface of the table. "This is a notarized affidavit from a Ms. Carol Brighton. Does that name ring a bell?" She was the private duty nurse for Mr. Davenport in his final month. For 30 years, she has lived with the guilt of what you made her do. It took us a while to find her living a quiet life in Oregon, but her memory is perfectly clear. She details how you instructed her to double my client's grandfather's morphine dosage an hour before you arrived with your lawyer, a man we've since discovered was a disbarred associate of yours, to sign the documents. Arthur stared at the paper, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. He remembered Carol, a mousy, nervous woman he'd easily intimidated, and paid handsomely for her silence. Chen continued, his voice relentless and methodical. He pulled out another document. "This is a forensic analysis of the letter you used to disown my client's mother, Jessica. The ink is a match for a pen manufactured 2 years after Mr. Davenport's death. The signature, while a clever attempt, lacks the distinctive pressure patterns of Mr. Davenport's writing in his final years. In short, it is a clumsy and provable forgery. One by one, David Chen laid out the pieces of Arthur Harrington's damnation. Each document was a nail in the coffin of his fabricated life. And this, Chen said, his voice dropping slightly. Drawing everyone in is the most important piece. He produced a thick, aged document, its paper yellowed and its ink faded but still legible. It was protected in a clear archival sleeve. This is the original notarized Davenport Family Trust document, dated 10 years before Mr. Davenport's passing, the one Ms. Davenport located last week. He held it up for all to see. It is an ironclad, irrevocable trust. It explicitly states that the family's primary residence, this house, and a controlling interest in Davenport Industries were to be held in trust for his direct descendants. It could not be sold. It could not be signed away. It could not be dissolved by an executor. Your entire claim to this property, Mr. Harrington, is based on a fraudulent transfer of an asset that was never legally available for transfer. He placed the document on the table. This paper is not just a claim to the house. It invalidates the very foundation of Harrington Global. The company you built was funded by assets you stole from the Davenport Trust. Every stock split, every acquisition, every dividend for the past 30 years has been the fruit of a poisoned tree. The scale of the crime was now horrifyingly clear to everyone. It wasn't just a house, it was everything. The entire Harrington empire was a house of cards built on a stolen foundation, and Joanna Davenport had just pulled out the bottom card. Arthur sputtered, words failing him. It's a fake. You faked it all." "We anticipated that accusation," Chen said smoothly. He gestured towards the service corridor. "Albert, would you mind stepping forward?" The elderly butler, Albert, shuffled into the room, his face a mixture of fear and profound relief. He had worked in this house since he was a boy of 16. He had served William Davenport with loyalty and love, and he had served Arthur Harrington with fear and resentment. Albert Chen said gently, "You were present in the days leading up to Mr. Davenport's death, were you not?" Albert nodded, his voice raspy with emotion. "Yes, sir." "I was. Do you recall a conversation with Mr. Davenport a few years prior about a special box he kept in his library, the humidor?" Albert whispered, his eyes finding Joanna's with a look of immense gratitude. "Mr. Davenport showed it to me once. He said, 'If anything ever happens to me, Albert, and things seem wrong, remember the bottom of the box. The real story is always at the bottom.' I never understood, and I was too afraid to look. Mr. Harrington, Albert's voice broke. He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. He had lived for 3 decades with a secret he was too terrified to act on. The final piece of proof was the human element, the nurse's confession, the butler's testimony, the unassailable legal document. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. Mr. Tanaka finally stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the marble floor. He gave Arthur a look of utter contempt. "Harrington-san," he said, his voice cold as ice, "our negotiations are concluded. My company does not do business with thieves." He then turned to Joanna and gave a deep, respectful bow. "Davenport-san, I am sorry for your family's hardship. I wish you success in reclaiming what is rightfully yours." With that, he and his entourage turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving a wake of shattered silence behind them. The spell was broken. The other guests, murmuring amongst themselves, began to rise, eager to distance themselves from the toxic fallout. The party was over. The Harrington era had ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical presentation of the truth. Arthur Harrington was left standing alone in the middle of the room, a king without a kingdom, a fraud exposed to the world. He looked at his wife, Beatrice, pleadingly, but she stared back at him as if he were a stranger. He looked at his son Ethan, who for the first time in his life looked at his father with something other than fear, pity. Finally, his wild, desperate eyes landed on Joanna, the maid, the girl he had tried to throw out into the street. She stood there no longer a servant, but the true mistress of the house, her quiet dignity, the most damning judgment of all. The departure of Kenji Tanaka was the first domino to fall. His exit was not just the collapse of a multi-billion-dollar deal, it was a public verdict. In the cutthroat world of high finance, reputation was currency, and Arthur Harrington had just been declared morally bankrupt in front of a roomful of his peers. As the other guests scrambled for the exits, their hasty goodbyes and averted gazes were like tiny cuts bleeding Arthur's power away drop by drop. They were distancing themselves from the scandal, quarantining themselves from his spectacular failure. The phones began to light up before they even reached their cars, spreading the story through the city's elite circles like wildfire. By morning, Harrington would be a toxic name. Left in the cavernous, half-empty ballroom, the Harrington family fractured. Beatrice was the first to move. She had stood by her husband for 25 years, a dutiful and decorative partner. She had endured his moods, his dismissiveness, and his affairs, all for the security and status of the Harrington name. But to learn that the name itself, the very bedrock of her existence, was a lie. That was an unforgivable betrayal. She walked over to him, her face unreadable. She didn't cry or scream. Her voice was chillingly calm. All these years, she said so quietly, only he could hear. I defended you. I hosted your parties. I raised your son in a house built on a crime. She slowly slipped the 15-carat diamond ring from her finger, the one he'd given her on their 10th anniversary. She placed it on the table beside a half-eaten bread roll. I believe this belongs to the Davenport estate as well. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her posture as erect and proud as ever. But this time, she wasn't walking towards her gilded cage of a bedroom. She was walking out the door, away from the lie she had unknowingly lived. Arthur watched her go, too stunned to even protest. He then turned his desperate gaze to his son. Ethan, say something. This is our family, our legacy. She's trying to destroy. Ethan looked at the floor, then at Joanna, then finally at his father. The bored, indifferent mask was gone, replaced by a painful, dawning clarity. His entire life, his expensive cars, his trust fund, his unearned place in the world was all fraudulent. He was the heir to nothing but a crime. What do you want me to say, Dad? Ethan asked, his voice raw. She's right, isn't she? That story, it sounded true. He finally understood his father's relentless pressure, his obsession with perfection and control. It wasn't ambition, it was the constant gnawing fear of being exposed. She spilled wine on a guest. Arthur shrieked his mind nonsensically, latching on to the initial trigger of the evening's disaster. I was within my rights. No, Dad, Ethan said, shaking his head slowly. You were cruel. You were always cruel. I just never understood why. He looked at Joanna with a strange mix of awe and shame. She had more character in her little finger than he'd ever demonstrated in his life. I think I need to go. He walked away, not following his mother, but simply disappearing into the shadows of the house, leaving his father utterly alone. Arthur Harrington was now a solitary figure amidst the ruins of his own party. The lavish food grew cold on the plates. The champagne lost its fizz. The chandeliers seemed to mock him with their brilliant, indifferent light. He turned to the only people left, Joanna and her lawyer. His rage, having nowhere else to go, surged back, hot and venomous. "You think you've won?" he snarled at Joanna, his voice a ragged mess. "You have no idea what you've just done. I will fight you. I will bury you in legal fees. I will drag this through the courts for 20 years. You will never see a dime, and you will never set foot in this house as anything other than the help." David Chen stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Arthur's unraveling fury. "I would advise against that, Mr. Harrington. The evidence is overwhelming. The public relations nightmare has already begun. By the time the markets open in New York tomorrow morning, your stock in Harrington Global will be in freefall. Your board of directors will be calling for your resignation before breakfast." Chen gestured around the magnificent room. "Every asset you have is traceable to the initial fraud. Your bank accounts will be frozen pending litigation. This house will be placed in receivership. You are for all intents and purposes already ruined. A protracted legal battle will only serve to land you in a federal prison for fraud, in addition to losing everything." The word prison finally broke through Arthur's wall of denial. The fight went out of him, replaced by a chilling, hollow fear. He looked around the ballroom, his ballroom at the tapestries, the paintings, the legacy he thought he had built. He saw now that he had built nothing. He had merely been squatting in another man's life. He sank into his chair at the head of the table, a king on a stolen throne, suddenly looking old, small, and utterly defeated. Joanna watched him, but she felt no triumph. There was no joy in witnessing a man's complete and total destruction, even a man who had caused her family so much pain. There was only a profound and weary sense of justice, a rebalancing of a universe that had been knocked off its axis for 30 years. She walked over to the trembling butler, Albert. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Albert," she said softly, "it's over. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Tears streamed freely down Albert's face as he looked at her. Truly, looked at her for the first time. In her features he could see the faint echo of her grandfather, William Davenport, the kind man who had given him his first job. Miss Davenport," he stammered. "Welcome home." That was the only victory that mattered. Not the money, not the company, not the ruin of Arthur Harrington. Just that simple, heartfelt welcome. The house had its rightful heir back. The ghosts of the past could finally rest. 3 months later, the autumn sun streamed through the same grand windows of the ballroom, but it illuminated a very different scene. The oppressive museum-like stillness of the Harrington era was gone. The heavy dark furniture had been replaced or rearranged, and the air once thick with tension and expensive perfume now smelled of lemon polish and fresh paint. The house was breathing again. Joanna Davenport stood in the center of the room, not in a maid's uniform, but in simple jeans and a comfortable sweater. She was overseeing the careful work of art restorers who were taking down the massive, ego-driven portraits of Arthur Harrington. Underneath one, they found the faint outline of a previous painting. "We found it," Miss Davenport, the head restorer, called down from his ladder. "It's him. The portrait of your grandfather. It looks like Harrington just had his own painted right over the top of it." A slow, genuine smile spread across Joanna's face. It was a perfect metaphor for everything that had happened. Arthur hadn't just replaced William Davenport. He had tried to crudely paint over him, hoping no one would ever look close enough to see the original masterpiece beneath. The legal fallout had been swift and brutal, just as David Chen had predicted. Faced with irrefutable evidence and public disgrace, Arthur Harrington had no choice but to capitulate. The courts moved quickly to restore the Davenport estate. The house, the company, and a significant portion of the assets generated over the past 30 years were returned to their rightful heir. Harrington Global was dissolved and restructured under its original name, Davenport Industries. Arthur Harrington, stripped of his wealth and his stolen identity, became a pariah. Beatrice finalized their divorce in record time, taking what little was left that wasn't tied to the fraud and disappearing to a quiet life in Europe. Ethan, to everyone's surprise, reached out to Joanna. In a short, humbled letter, he apologized for his family's actions and his own cowardice. He refused any claim to the Harrington name and was last heard of working for a non-profit organization in South America, trying to build a life of his own, free from the shadow of his father's crimes. Arthur himself faced multiple federal charges. His trial was a media sensation, a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in a minimum security prison. The man who once ruled a boardroom now shared a small cell. Joanna, however, focused not on the past's punishment, but on the future's restoration. She appointed a new ethical board to run Davenport Industries with a mandate to focus on sustainable innovation and employee welfare, the principles her grandfather had championed. She made Albert the official estate manager of the Davenport mansion, giving him a home for the rest of his life and the dignity he had been denied for so long. He took immense joy in restoring the house to the way he remembered it from his youth, sharing stories with Joanna about her grandfather's habits, his favorite chair, the way he liked his tea. Through him, she was able to meet the man she had never known. One sunny afternoon, Joanna stood on the grand balcony, looking out over the sprawling lawns where a tire swing had once hung. The name Davenport was being carefully recarved into the stone archway at the main gate. The house was no longer a gilded cage or a monument to a lie. It was a home again. Her home. Her journey had started in the shadows, a quest for vengeance, fueled by a lifetime of inherited pain. But in reclaiming her family's legacy, she had found something more than just justice. She had found herself. She was not just the maid who stunned a mansion, nor the heiress who toppled an empire. She was Joanna Davenport, the guardian of a legacy, a builder of a new future on an old and honored foundation. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful, filled with the promise of a story not ending, but finally truly beginning. And so Joanna Davenport's story shows us that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, has a way of rising to the surface. It's a powerful reminder that dignity and courage are not defined by wealth or status, but by the strength to stand up for what is right, even when you're standing alone. One woman armed with nothing but the truth and a righteous heart was able to reclaim her past and redefine her future, proving that true power isn't about who you can command, but about the legacy you honor. What did you think of Arthur Harrington's spectacular downfall? Was it karma justice, or both? And what about Beatrice and Ethan? Do you think they deserved their fate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of justice and resilience moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a story of the underdog winning, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life dramas. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light. Thank you for listening.